On the morning of October 6, 1973, at exactly 1:55 p.m. local time, the skies over the Golan Heights erupted in fire. Syrian MiG-21 jets screamed across the border, followed by a thunderous artillery barrage that shook the earth for miles. Simultaneously, thousands of miles to the south, Egyptian forces were crossing the Suez Canal in a coordinated assault that would change the course of Middle Eastern history forever. But here's what makes this story truly haunting. The Central Intelligence Agency had warned Israel this attack was coming. They had provided detailed intelligence, they had given dates, troop movements, and strategic assessments, and for 72 crucial hours, the Israeli cabinet chose to ignore it. This is the story of how one of the most sophisticated intelligence communities in the world failed to prevent a surprise attack that nearly destroyed their nation. This is a story about human error, political blindness, and the devastating price of certainty. If you find this story as gripping as I do, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you these untold stories from history that deserve to be remembered. Now let me take you back to the autumn of 1973. Tel Aviv in late September was experiencing the kind of golden weather that made the Mediterranean coast shimmer like polished bronze. The beaches were still crowded with families enjoying the last warm days before the Jewish high holidays. In sidewalk cafes, young couples sipped Turkish coffee while elderly men played backgammon under striped awnings. The country was preparing for Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, a day of fasting, prayer, and reflection. Prime Minister Golda Meir sat in her modest kitchen in the Ramat Aviv neighborhood, as she often did when she needed to think. At 75 years old, she had survived more crises than most people could imagine. Born in Kiev, raised in Milwaukee, she had helped build this nation from the desert sand. Her face bore the deep lines of responsibility, and her steel-gray hair was pulled back in her characteristic practical style. She was reviewing intelligence reports while chain-smoking her ever-present cigarettes, a habit her doctors had long since given up trying to break. The reports in front of her were troubling. Egyptian military exercises along the Suez Canal had been ongoing for weeks. Syrian troop movements in the Golan had increased significantly. But military intelligence, known as Aman, continued to assess that war was unlikely. The phone rang, cutting through the quiet morning. "Golda," said the familiar gravelly voice of Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, "we need to talk. Can you come to the Kiryat this afternoon?" The Kiryat, the Israeli Defense Forces headquarters compound in central Tel Aviv, was where all major military decisions were made. Golda stubbed out her cigarette and reached for another. "What? Is it, Moshe? More exercises?" "Perhaps. But there are some details that concern me. The Americans have sent something through back channels." Golda felt the familiar tightening in her chest that had accompanied every major crisis since 1948. "I'll be there at 3. What Golda didn't know yet was that the document waiting for her at the Kiryat would represent one of the most significant intelligence warnings in CIA history, and the decisions made in the next 72 hours would haunt her for the rest of her life. In Washington, D.C., the humid September air hung heavy over Langley, Virginia. The Central Intelligence Agency headquarters, that imposing modernist building nestled among the trees, was operating at heightened alert. Director William Colby, a lean man with the quiet intensity of a career intelligence officer, was reviewing reports from multiple sources that all pointed to the same conclusion. The Arabs were going to attack. Colby had spent his career reading intelligence, first as an OSS officer in World War II, later running operations in Vietnam. He knew when sources converged on a conclusion, when the noise separated from the signal. And right now, every signal was screaming danger. "Get me the Middle East desk," he told his assistant, "and prepare a cable for the station chief in Tel Aviv." The man who would receive that cable was a seasoned CIA operative who had spent years cultivating sources throughout the region. He had agents in Cairo's Damascus and Beirut. He had developed relationships with Israeli intelligence that went beyond official channels, and he was increasingly alarmed by what he was hearing. In Cairo, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was putting the final touches on Operation Badr, named after the Prophet Muhammad's first military victory. Sadat was a patient man. He had been planning this moment for years, ever since the humiliation of the 1967 Six-Day War, when Israel had seized the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights in just 6 days of fighting. That defeat had been a wound to Arab pride that refused to heal. Sadat knew that Egypt could not simply accept the status quo. The Sinai was Egyptian land, and he intended to get it back. But Sadat was also a pragmatist. He didn't believe Egypt could defeat Israel in a total war. The Jewish state's military, equipped with American weapons and hardened by constant conflict, was simply too strong. But he didn't need to win a total war. He needed to win a limited war, one that would restore Arab honor and force the superpowers to negotiate a settlement. In Damascus, Syrian President Hafez al-Assad was motivated by similar calculations, though his goals were more ambitious. He wanted the Golan Heights back, those strategic hills from which Syrian artillery had once been able to shell Israeli settlements below. And unlike Sadat, Assad believed total victory might actually be possible if they caught Israel by surprise. The two leaders had been coordinating in secret for months. The attack would come simultaneously on two fronts, forcing Israel to divide its forces. And it would come on Yom Kippur, when much of the Israeli army would be on leave and the country would be at a standstill. It was, they believed, the perfect plan. Back in Tel Aviv, Major General Eli Zera, the head of military intelligence, was a man of supreme confidence. At 45, he was young for such a senior position, but he had impressed his superiors with his analytical mind and decisive manner, perhaps too decisive. Zera had developed what became known as the concept, a set of assumptions about Arab intentions that had calcified into near-religious certainty within Israeli intelligence circles. The concept held that Egypt would not attack until it had acquired long-range bombers capable of striking deep into Israel and surface-to-surface missiles that could threaten Israeli cities. Syria, according to the concept, would never attack without Egypt. Since Egypt had not yet acquired these weapons, war was impossible. Never mind that the Egyptians had been moving troops and equipment toward the canal for weeks. Never mind that Syrian armor was massing in the Golan. These were exercises, provocation, posturing. The Arabs were not ready for war. Zera believed this with the certainty of a man who had stopped questioning his own assumptions. On September 25, 1973, a secret meeting took place in a nondescript office building in London. The man who arrived was one of the most valuable intelligence assets of the 20th century, though his true identity would remain hidden for decades. His code name was the Angel. His real name was Ashraf Marwan. Marwan was the son-in-law of the late Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser. He had direct access to the highest levels of Egyptian government, and for reasons that historians still debate, he had been passing secrets to Israeli intelligence for years. That September night in London, Marwan met with his Israeli handler and delivered a warning that should have changed history. "The attack is coming," he said. "Egypt and Syria will strike simultaneously. They have chosen a date, Yom Kippur." The Israeli handler felt his blood run cold. "Are you certain?" "I am certain. Sadat has made his decision. The armies are already moving into position. You have perhaps 2 weeks to prepare." This information was transmitted immediately to Tel Aviv. It landed on Eli Zera's desk the next morning, and Zera dismissed it. The reason he gave was that Marwan had issued warnings before that had not materialized. He had predicted war in May 1973, and it hadn't happened. Perhaps Marwan was unreliable. Perhaps he was being fed disinformation by the Egyptians. Perhaps he was even a double agent, trying to keep Israel in a constant state of alert to wear down their military readiness. In truth, the May warning had been accurate. Sadat had planned to attack that spring, but postponed at the last minute due to Soviet pressure. But this context was lost in Zera's certainty. Meanwhile, in Langley, CIA analysts were reaching their own conclusions. They had satellite imagery showing Egyptian pontoon bridges being moved toward the canal. They had intercepts of Syrian military communications indicating increased readiness. They had human intelligence from multiple sources all pointing to the same conclusion. On September 30th, the CIA issued a formal assessment. Egypt and Syria were preparing for war. The attack could come within days. This assessment was transmitted to Israel through official channels. It arrived at the Foreign Ministry, was forwarded to the Prime Minister's office, and ended up in the growing stack of intelligence reports that Golda Meir was reviewing. But the report came with a caveat. Israeli military intelligence, the cable noted, did not share the CIA's assessment. The Israelis believed the Arab movements were exercises, not preparations for attack. This caveat would prove fatal. Golda Meir was a woman who trusted her own people. She had worked with Israeli intelligence for decades. These were the men who had built one of the most effective intelligence services in the world, who had pulled off spectacular operations like the capture of Adolf Eichmann, who had penetrated Arab governments at the highest levels. If they said war was unlikely, who was she to disagree based on American assessments made from thousands of miles away? She set the CIA report aside and moved on to the next item on her agenda. On October 1, 1973, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan toured the Golan Heights. The legendary general, with his distinctive black eye patch and swagger, had been one of the architects of Israel's stunning victory in 1967. He had personally led the capture of the old city of Jerusalem. He was in many ways the living symbol of Israeli military invincibility. What he saw on the Golan that day should have alarmed him. Syrian forces had nearly tripled their usual deployment along the ceasefire line. Tanks were hull down in firing positions. Artillery batteries were ranged on Israeli positions. Support units were moving forward. But Dayan, like Zera, was a prisoner of the concept. He saw what he expected to see. An exercise, a show of force, perhaps an attempt to probe Israeli reactions. He did not see what was actually there, an army preparing to attack. "They're not ready for war," he told his aides as they drove back to Tel Aviv. "They know what happened in 1967. They're not stupid enough to try again." On October 3rd, the CIA issued another warning. This one was more urgent. Egyptian and Syrian forces were now at full combat readiness. Naval vessels were deploying. Aircraft were being dispersed to secondary airfields. All indicators pointed to imminent hostilities. Again, the warning reached Israel. Again, it was filtered through military intelligence. Again, Zera concluded that the Americans were overreacting. "The Arabs are conducting the largest exercises in their history," he told Golda Meir in a briefing that afternoon. "They want to demonstrate their strength. They want to keep us on edge, but they are not going to attack. They know they cannot win." Golda listened, smoking her cigarettes, saying little. She wanted to believe Zera. She needed to believe him. A full mobilization of Israeli reserves would cost tens of millions of dollars and disrupt the entire economy. It would anger the Americans, who were urging restraint. It would play into Arab hands by making Israel look like the aggressor. And it would ruin Yom Kippur for millions of Israeli citizens. "Very well," she said finally. "Continue monitoring, but no mobilization." That evening, Golda went home to her small apartment. She couldn't sleep. Something gnawed at her, some instinct that told her the analysts were wrong. But she couldn't act on instinct. She needed evidence, and all the evidence she was receiving said war was unlikely. At 2:30 a.m. on October 5th, the phone rang in the bedroom of Zvi Zamir, the director of Mossad, Israel's external intelligence service. The voice on the other end was urgent. "The angel wants to meet. Tonight, it's critical." Zamir was on a plane to London within hours. He arrived exhausted but alert, his adrenaline pumping. If Marwan was calling an emergency meeting, something had changed. They met in a hotel room as dawn was breaking over the city. Marwan looked pale, agitated, nothing like his usual composed self. "War," he said. "Tomorrow, Yom Kippur. The attack will come in the early evening, coordinated strikes on both fronts." Zamir felt the world shift beneath his feet. "You're certain?" "I've seen the orders myself. The armies are already moving. You have less than 24 hours. Zamir immediately called Tel Aviv. The message was transmitted to Golda Meir's military secretary, who woke her at 4:30 a.m. Israeli time. "Madam Prime Minister, we have urgent intelligence. War is coming today." Golda's hands trembled as she lit a cigarette. Call an emergency meeting of the cabinet. Get Dayan, get the chief of staff, get everyone. I want them in my office in 2 hours." The meeting convened at 8:00 a.m. on October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur morning. The streets of Tel Aviv were quiet. Most families were still asleep, preparing for a day of fasting and prayer. The synagogues would fill by noon. The highways were nearly empty, as they always were on this holiest of days. Around the table sat the men who would determine Israel's fate. Golda Meir, grim-faced and chain-smoking. Moshe Dayan, for once looking uncertain. Lieutenant General David Elazar, the chief of staff, who had been pushing for mobilization for days. Eli Zera, still maintaining that the intelligence was ambiguous. "What time?" Golda asked. "Our source says early evening around 6 p.m., Zamir replied. Elazar leaned forward. "Madam Prime Minister, we must mobilize the reserves immediately. We must call up everyone." Dayan shook his head. "A full mobilization will be seen as an aggressive act. The Americans will be furious, and if the intelligence is wrong, we will have disrupted the holiest day of the year for nothing." "And if it's right?" Elazar demanded. "We have fewer than 200 tanks on the Golan against more than 1,000 Syrian tanks. We have 3,000 men defending the Suez against 800,000 Egyptians. If they attack with full force and we haven't mobilized, we will be overrun." The argument continued for nearly an hour. In the end, Golda made a fateful decision. She authorized a partial mobilization, calling up some reserve units, but not all. She also decided Prague against a preemptive strike on Syrian and Egyptian forces, fearing international condemnation. "We will not fire the first shot," she said. "If they attack, we will respond, but we will not give the world an excuse to blame us." It was, in retrospect, a catastrophic error. The partial mobilization meant that Israeli forces would be badly outnumbered when the attack came. The decision not to strike first meant that Egyptian and Syrian forces would be able to cross their starting lines intact. But there was another error that morning, one that would have consequences measured in lives. The attack did not come at 6 p.m. It came at 1:55 p.m., more than 4 hours earlier than expected. Later analysis would reveal that Egypt had deliberately fed false information to Marwan about the timing, suspecting that he might warn Israel. The deception worked perfectly. Israeli forces, expecting an evening attack, were caught completely off guard when Syrian jets screamed over the Golan at midday. On the Golan Heights, the first man to see the attack coming was a young observation officer named Yossi Levy, manning a listening post called Position 107. He heard the Syrian artillery. Before he saw it, a sound like distant thunder that quickly grew into a continuous roar. Then the sky filled with aircraft, and the ground began to shake. "They're coming!" he screamed into his radio. "All units! Syrian attack! Full-scale assault!" Within minutes, Position 107 was surrounded by Syrian infantry. Yossi and his small team fought for 6 hours before being overrun. He was 22 years old. Across the Golan, similar scenes were playing out. The 7th Armored Brigade, defending the northern sector, found itself facing 3 Syrian divisions. The 188th Armored Brigade in the south was even more badly outnumbered. Israeli tank crews, many of them reservists who had been called up only hours before, scrambled to their vehicles and drove straight into the largest tank battle since World War II. At the Suez Canal, the Egyptian assault was even more massive. 8,000 Egyptian commandos crossed in rubber boats under cover of the artillery barrage. Engineers began building pontoon bridges while infantry used high-pressure water hoses to carve openings through the Israeli sand fortifications. The Bar-Lev line, which Israeli military planners had believed would hold for days, began to crumble within hours. In Tel Aviv, the news arrived in fragments, each worse than the last. Positions overrun, units surrounded, casualties mounting. The carefully prepared defense plans were falling apart. Moshe Dayan, the hero of 1967, looked like a different man. His face had gone gray, his hands shook. That evening, he would tell Golda Meir something that stunned her. They might need to consider using nuclear weapons. It was the only time in Israeli history that such a suggestion was seriously made. Golda refused to panic. "We will fight with what we have," she said. "Get me the American ambassador." The call to U.S. Ambassador Kenneth Keating was brief and desperate. Israel needed weapons, ammunition, spare parts. Their stockpiles had been calculated for a war of days, not weeks. If the fighting continued at this intensity, they would run out of basic supplies. Keating promised to relay the message to Washington immediately. What followed was a political drama that nearly tore the American government apart. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who was managing the American response, had his own agenda. He wanted a war that ended in a draw, one that would make both sides willing to negotiate. He feared that if Israel won too quickly, as it had in 1967, there would be no incentive for peace. If Israel lost, it would be a catastrophe. A drawn-out conflict that exhausted both sides might actually lead to a settlement. This calculation, coldly logical in diplomatic terms, meant that American aid was slow to arrive. For 3 agonizing days, as Israeli forces fought desperately to hold the line, the resupply was delayed by bureaucratic obstacles and political considerations. On the Golan Heights, the situation grew critical on October 8th. Syrian tanks broke through the Israeli lines at several points and began descending toward the Jordan Valley. If they reached the valley, nothing would stop them from driving into the heart of Israel. One woman stood in their way. Her name was Zvaka Greengold, and she was 21 years old. Zvaka was on leave when the war started. He hitchhiked to the nearest army base, was given a tank, and drove north alone to find the battle. For the next 20 hours, he would fight a single-handed action against Syrian armor that would become legend. Moving constantly, often engaging multiple tanks at once, Zvika destroyed dozens of Syrian vehicles while convincing the enemy that he was a much larger force. When his tank was hit and he was burned, he found another tank. When that one was hit, he found another. He kept fighting until the reserves finally arrived. "I am the force," he radioed repeatedly, using the call sign Force Zvika. Force Zvika is engaging the enemy. The Syrians, hearing radio traffic about Force Zvika from multiple positions, believed they were facing an entire armored battalion. They slowed their advance, called for reinforcements, and gave the Israeli reserves precious hours to arrive. Zvika survived the war. He received the Medal of Valor, Israel's highest military decoration. But he would struggle for years with the trauma of what he had witnessed and done. In Cairo, Anwar Sadat watched the first days of the war with satisfaction. His forces had achieved complete surprise. They had crossed the canal, broken through the Bar-Lev line, and established a strong defensive position on the eastern bank. Egyptian soldiers had restored their honor after the humiliation of 1967, but Sadat made a critical error on October 14th. Pressured by the Syrians, who were now being pushed back on the Golan, he ordered his armor to advance beyond the protective umbrella of their surface-to-air missiles. The result was the largest tank battle since Kursk. In World War II, Israeli tank crews, fighting on familiar ground with shorter supply lines, destroyed more than 200 Egyptian tanks while losing only a handful of their own. The momentum of the war shifted. On October 15th, Israeli forces under General Ariel Sharon found a gap between 2 Egyptian armies and began crossing to the west bank of the Suez Canal. It was an audacious move, sending troops behind enemy lines, but Sharon had always been audacious. Within days, Israeli forces were advancing toward Cairo. The superpower dynamics now shifted dramatically. The Soviets, alarmed by the Egyptian reverses, began massive airlifts of weapons to their Arab allies. The Americans, finally overcoming their hesitation, launched Operation Nickel Grass, one of the largest military airlifts in history. C-5 Galaxy and C-141 Starlifter aircraft began landing at Israeli airfields around the clock, bringing tanks, ammunition, and everything else the IDF needed. The war had become a proxy conflict between the superpowers. Both Washington and Moscow feared it could spiral into something much larger. On October 22nd, with Israeli forces threatening to encircle the Egyptian Third Army, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 338, calling for an immediate ceasefire. Both sides, exhausted and running low on supplies, agreed. The guns fell silent. But the reckoning had just begun. In Tel Aviv, Golda Meir sat alone in her office, surrounded by the wreckage of a shattered certainty. More than 2,500 Israeli soldiers were dead. Thousands more were wounded. The myth of Israeli invincibility had been shattered. She had won the war, but she had lost something more important: the trust of her people. The questions came immediately and did not stop. How had military intelligence failed so completely? Why had the warnings been ignored? Who was responsible for the soldiers who died in those first terrible hours? Golda called Eli Zera to her office. The head of military intelligence looked nothing like the confident man who had assured her that war was impossible. His face was haggard. He had aged years in weeks. "Eli," she said quietly, "I need to understand. We had the information. Why didn't we see what was coming?" Zera's answer would become famous. "We saw what we expected to see," he said. "The concept told us what the Arabs would do. When they did something different, we couldn't believe it. And the CIA warnings? We thought the Americans were overreacting. They didn't understand the region the way we did. They didn't have our sources." Golda stubbed out her cigarette. "But their assessment was correct, and ours was wrong." "Yes," Zera admitted. "Their assessment was correct." The investigation that followed, known as the Agranat Commission, would ultimately hold Zera and other intelligence officers responsible for the failure. Golda Meir and Moshe Dayan were officially cleared, but the public did not forgive them. April 1974. Golda resigned. She was replaced by Yitzhak Rabin, a hero of 1967 who had spent the Yom Kippur War as ambassador to Washington, watching helplessly from afar. Dayan's political career was effectively over. The man who had embodied Israeli military prowess would never hold major office again. He died in 1981, still haunted by the war that had destroyed his reputation. But the full story of those 72 hours would not emerge for years. It was only later that the depth of the intelligence failure became clear. The CIA had not just warned of a general threat. Their assessments had been remarkably specific. They had identified troop concentrations, predicted timing, analyzed intentions. They had done everything an intelligence service could do to warn an ally. And that warning had been systematically dismissed because it conflicted with what Israeli intelligence believed to be true. The lesson was profound and terrifying. The best intelligence in the world is worthless if the people receiving it cannot overcome their own assumptions. Confirmation bias, the tendency to accept information that confirms what we already believe and reject information that contradicts it, had nearly destroyed a nation. But there was another lesson, one that would take longer to learn. Anwar Sadat had achieved his real objective. Not the destruction of Israel, which he had never seriously pursued, but the restoration of Egyptian honor and the creation of conditions for peace. 4 years after the war, in 1977, he would make his historic trip to Jerusalem, beginning the process that led to the Camp David Accords and the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab state. The Yom Kippur War, born from intelligence failure and military surprise, ultimately led to peace. History moves in strange ways. For the families of those 2,500 soldiers who died, of course, the lessons of history were cold comfort. They had lost fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. Many had never even had a chance to fight, killed in their positions before they knew the war had started. Every year on Yom Kippur, Israel remembers them. The synagogues fill with worshippers, but the prayers carry a different weight than they did before October 1973. The fast is still observed, but it tastes of ashes and memory. In Jerusalem, there is a memorial to the fallen of the Yom Kippur War. It lists their names, rank by rank, unit by unit. Young men, mostly, their lives barely begun when they ended. Some were new immigrants who had come to Israel seeking safety and found instead a desperate battle for survival. Walking past those names, one cannot help but wonder how many of them might have lived if the warnings had been heeded, if the mobilization had come 48 hours earlier, if the concept had been questioned instead of defended. There are no answers to such questions, only the names, carved in stone, and the silence of the dead. Moshe Dayan visited the memorial once, near the end of his life. A journalist who accompanied him noted that the famous general said nothing for a long time. He simply stood before the wall of names, his one visible eye moving slowly from left to right, reading. Finally, he spoke. "We failed them," he said. "All our experience, all our intelligence, all our confidence. We failed them." The journalist asked that if he had any regrets. Dayan considered the question. "Regrets are for things you could have changed but didn't," he said. "What I feel is something worse. We had the information, we had the warnings, we had everything we needed to save these boys. And we didn't see it, not because we couldn't, but because we wouldn't." He walked away then, leaving the journalist with a question that has haunted Israeli military thinking ever since. How do you prevent yourself from being blinded by your own certainty? The CIA, for its part, learned its own lessons from the Yom Kippur War. The failure to convince the Israelis of the coming attack, despite having correct intelligence, led to significant reforms in how warnings were communicated to allies. The concept of warning intelligence became a specialized field, focused not just on gathering information, but on ensuring it was heard and acted upon. But bureaucracies have short memories, and the same patterns would repeat themselves in different forms. Intelligence failures would continue to occur, not because the information wasn't available, but because it wasn't believed. In the years after the war, Ashraf Marwan, the angel, continued to live a life of mystery. He became a wealthy businessman in London, moving in high circles, seemingly untouched by his double life. It was only in 2002 that his identity was publicly revealed by an Israeli historian, a revelation that may have cost him his life. In 2007, Marwan fell from the balcony of his London apartment and died. Was it suicide, murder, an accident? The questions have never been answered. His funeral in Cairo was attended by thousands, including senior Egyptian officials who praised him as a patriot. The truth about Marwan may never be fully known. Was he an Israeli agent who betrayed his country? Or was he an Egyptian double agent who fed Israel just enough real intelligence to make his disinformation credible? Historians continue to debate his legacy, but one thing is certain: his warnings about the Yom Kippur War were accurate. Whatever game he was playing, he tried to prevent the surprise. Golda Meir spent her remaining years writing her memoirs and reflecting on her decisions. She never fully accepted the criticism directed at her, arguing that she had acted on the best available intelligence. But in private moments, friends reported, she was haunted by the faces of young soldiers she had met before the war, boys who were now buried in military cemeteries. She died in 1978, just months before the Camp David Accords were signed. She never saw the peace that the Yom Kippur War ultimately made possible. Her legacy remains contested. To some, she was the iron-willed grandmother who held Israel together in its darkest hour, who refused to panic even when her defense minister suggested nuclear weapons. To others, she was the leader who ignored warnings, delayed mobilization, and sent young men to die unprepared. Perhaps both views are true. History is rarely simple. What is beyond debate is the intelligence failure that preceded the war. The CIA's warnings were correct, they were specific, they were timely, and they were ignored. In the annals of intelligence history, the Yom Kippur War stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of certainty. The Israelis were not stupid, they were not incompetent, they were in many ways among the best intelligence professionals in the world, but they had become so confident in their understanding of the enemy that they could not accept evidence that contradicted it. The concept was their blindfold. They had created a framework for understanding Arab intentions that made sense, that fit the evidence they had gathered over years. When new evidence arrived that contradicted the concept, they found ways to explain it away rather than question their assumptions. This is a universal human tendency, one that affects individuals and institutions alike. We see what we expect to see. We hear what we expect to hear. We believe what we want to believe. The Yom Kippur War was a tragedy that need not have happened. Or rather, it was a tragedy whose cost could have been greatly reduced if different decisions had been made in those crucial 72 hours. Today, the lessons of that failure are taught in intelligence academies around the world. Students learn about the dangers of confirmation bias, the importance of considering alternative hypotheses, the need to question assumptions even when they seem obviously correct. But learning about a lesson is not the same as learning it. The human capacity for self-deception is vast and creative. Every generation must discover anew the dangers of certainty. In October 2023, 50 years after the Yom Kippur War, Israel commemorated the anniversary with ceremonies and reflection. Veterans who had fought in the conflict, now elderly men, gathered to remember fallen comrades and speak to young soldiers about what they had experienced. Their message was always the same: never assume you know what the enemy will do. Never become so confident that you stop questioning yourself. Never ignore a warning just because it doesn't fit your expectations. The ghosts of the Yom Kippur War still haunt Israeli military doctrine. Every intelligence assessment now includes dissenting views. Every warning from foreign services is taken seriously, even if it contradicts Israeli analysis. The concept, as a way of thinking, has been officially repudiated. But bureaucratic reforms cannot change human nature. The tendency to believe what we want to believe, to see what we expect to see, remains embedded in our psychology. It takes constant vigilance to overcome. That is, perhaps the final lesson of those 72 hours in 1973. Intelligence failures are not just about information, they're about people, about institutions, about the gap between what we know and what we are willing to accept. The CIA warned Israel that Syria would attack on Yom Kippur. The cabinet ignored the report for 72 hours, and 2,500 young men paid the price. It is a story worth remembering. Not because it assigns blame, though there is blame enough to go around. Not because it provides easy answers, because there are no easy answers. But because it reminds us that certainty is dangerous, that assumptions must be questioned, and that the price of being wrong can be measured in human lives. In the end, the Yom Kippur War was not lost. Israel survived, fought back, and ultimately prevailed. The peace that followed, imperfect though it was, changed the Middle East forever. But the soldiers who died in those first hours, caught by surprise because their leaders could not believe what they were being told, deserve to be remembered. They deserve to have their story told. This has been that story. Thank you for watching. The next time you are certain about something, the next time you dismiss information because it doesn't fit what you already believe, remember the Yom Kippur War. Remember the warnings that were ignored. Remember the price that was paid. And ask yourself, what am I not seeing because I don't want to see it? The answer might save your life or someone else's.